Alright, so what we got for you guys today is the original plans for Avengers Endgame. We already watched the original plans for the Avengers 1 and Avengers Age of Ultron, so it only makes more sense to watch the Endgame one. I'm extremely excited for this, but I feel like I would be more excited for Infinity War, which I have not made yet, which I will be making. So Infinity War will probably drop before this one, or maybe this will drop before that one. I don't know. I'll just figure it out because I've been kind of doing them in order, but we're going to check this out, see what the original plans were, and we're going to go from there.
What if, in Avengers Endgame, Tony and Cap died together?
Which, hot take maybe, I think Avengers Infinity War is better than Endgame. If you think so or don't think so, let me know in the comments, but I actually do 100% believe that Infinity War is better than Endgame.
Well, they almost did. In fact, at one point, all of the original 6 Avengers would have met their end. There also would have been no portals, Nick Fury would have died, the time heist wouldn't have gone back to New York 2012, Thor would have fought a younger version of himself, Stark would have went to Asgard, and Thanos and Doctor Strange would have had a rematch.
This is a lot.
So let's dive in and find out why these changes happened, resulting in the movie we got, and also take a look at what could have been Endgame. Kevin Feige originally pitched a Toy Story 3 style ending, where all of the original Avengers would sacrifice themselves together. However, directors Joe and Anthony Russo pushed back against this idea, believing it was too extreme and that audiences wouldn't be able to process such a massive loss.
See, I don't think they're gonna say more, but I don't think if all the heroes die in a moment like that to sacrifice themselves to save everybody, I don't think that's necessarily bad, just depending on how you go about it, because that could be your reboot, and then that's when you redo everything else, because now the story is still continuing, which isn't bad, but it can become bad based off of if what's continuing is like bad, if it just sucks. That's why like Doomsday has to be good, and then Secret Wars has to be immaculate. So it's like I'm somebody too where like in movies and shows and whatever, if the heroes die for a justifiable reason that ends the story in a really good, really tight way, then I'm for it, even if it is sad and really fucked up. But I don't know. We're going to see what they say.
Instead,
I just don't think it would have been that extreme. I think that they actually just wanted to extend the story and keep it going, which isn't bad either if you have a good story going, but we're going to see.
Opted for a more balanced approach, choosing specific characters to make sacrifices at key moments to allow for emotional catharsis while maintaining the film's momentum. The Russos at one point considered having Cap and Tony die together. However, producer Nate Moore suggested the idea of Steve reuniting with Peggy Carter, figuring that giving him a chance at personal happiness would be a more meaningful and unexpected resolution. Unlike Tony, whose arc revolved around learning self-sacrifice, harkening all the way back to Cap's line in the first Avengers when he tells Stark, "You're not the guy who makes a sacrifice play," Cap had always been willing to lay down his life for the greater good. What he never allowed himself was a life of his own. By sending Steve back in time to be with Peggy, the film gave him closure in a way that honored his character without resorting to another tragic farewell. Plus, the Russos felt it would be better to have varied outcomes for the characters, as it's less predictable and creates a richer ending. However, an earlier draft of the film saw Thanos traveling back in time to kill every Avenger in 2012, and dropping the decapitated head of past Captain America at the feet of present-day Steve Rogers. Tony Stark's death
that would have been fucking cool. Because then it would have been on some like, oh, like, I fought you before. I've been here. Dude, that would have been so cool. That would have been extreme for like some people. But if I would have seen that, I don't even like Captain America. But if I would have seen that, dude, I would have been like, oh, this is about to be a crazy fight. And imagine how Captain America would feel, like fighting somebody who he knows killed him in the past. That would have been nuts.
See very differently. In the initial version of the scene, he never repeated his now iconic line, "I am Iron Man," which was a powerful callback to the first film.
Yep.
Thanos didn't say anything either. In this version, which was shot, Thanos simply put on the gauntlet, gave Stark a knowing look as if to say, "I've won," and snapped his fingers, only to realize in stunned disbelief that nothing happened. He then turned to Tony, who silently raised his hand and snapped instead. While beautifully shot and emotionally resonant, something was missing. A thematic resolution for Thanos. The Russos realized that Thanos' arc in Endgame was built around his belief of inevitability.
Alright, so before they keep going, Iron Man, Thanos saying that I am inevitable, snapping and it not working, and then Tony Stark saying I am Iron Man, that is cold. If they would have took that out the movie, that would have been a missed opportunity, because even whenever he like raises his hand and he's got the stones, Like, I'm waiting for him to snap, but I'm waiting for him to say, I am Iron Man. And I'm sitting there like, oh, he's going to say it. So I couldn't have imagined if he wouldn't have said it. I'd have been like, oh, shit, okay, I guess you're just... Fuck it.
The idea that no matter how hard the Avengers tried, they could never truly defeat him. For the film's conclusion to have true thematic weight, Thanos needed to verbalize this belief one last time by saying, I am inevitable, which led the filmmakers to Tony's response, and I am Iron Man.
Yes.
However, reshooting that scene was a challenge. Downey had already said his emotional goodbyes to the cast, and mentally and emotionally moved on from the role, assuming that last day on set was the last he'd ever play the character. However, Feige and the Russos convinced him that the line was necessary to the film's story. Adding to the poignancy, when he finally returned to shoot the new ending, it was on a stage directly across from where he had originally auditioned for Iron Man. His final moment as Tony Stark was filmed just a few hundred feet away from where his journey began, bringing his story full circle in the most poetic way possible.
Yeah, and that probably helped him, like, with the whole emotional side of, like, acting in that, like, sense. Like, him being right where it started physically probably, like, made him, like, oh, like, I can do this part. And especially him knowing, like, this is the final scene that I'm going to play as this character. Like, it had to be, like, heartbreaking. So that made that scene 10 times even more better. For him as a person and for, like, us as the audience.
The writers also originally wrote a number of dying words for Tony, but Downey thought it would be much more powerful for Tony to shut up for once and die silently. His fellow Avengers also originally took a knee afterwards, but this was cut out of the final film, as was a scene where Tony visits the Soul World after snapping his fingers to meet his grown-up daughter Morgan, which the Russos felt was confusing and disrupted the emotional weight of his death. At one point, Nick Fury would have died in a brutal confrontation with Thanos' Black Order. In a moment meant to mirror Agent Coulson's death in the Avengers, Fury would have been stabbed from behind by Corvus Glaive.
See, I don't even like Fury like that. But I think that if he would have got jumped by them and then died, like on some like Pain versus Jiraiya shit, and if he just would have like stood there and looked at all of them and he's like, all right, well, I'm about to fucking go out. And he's like fighting them and then dies, I think everybody would have felt emotional about it. Like, I wouldn't have cried or nothing, but I would have been like, oh my fucking God. Because I remember seeing him on the screen for the first time at the end of Iron Man 1. And then he literally he talks to Tony Stark. It's like, we need a team. And then I'm like, oh my God. And I'm like fucking, I don't know how old, like 10 or something. It was crazy, bro.
Scene been kept, Captain Marvel, where Fury plays a major role alongside Brie Larson's Carol Danvers, would have effectively served as a swan song. In fact, Fury's post-credit scene in Infinity War, where he pages Captain Marvel, was almost scrapped as well. The Russos revealed that they originally considered not including any post-credit scene at all, wanting audiences to sit with the full weight of the film's devastating ending. In the end, however, they chose to feature Fury's desperate call to Captain Marvel, offering fans a small glimmer of hope, and of course, to tease the next movie. And speaking of the end of Infinity...
Dude, if that movie would not have had an after credit scene, that would have hit 35 times more harder. Because we would have been sitting there like, where's the after credit scene? And it never would have happened, and we would have been like, oh my God, that's how it's ending? But then we also would have it would have been like the snap took away the potential of anything. It would have hit a little harder. If they would have done that, that would have been so cool.
War, the heartbreaking scene where Hawkeye's family vanishes due to the snap was originally planned for
and then people also didn't like Captain Marvel also.
The end of Infinity War. The idea was to show that Thanos' actions had consequences beyond the battlefield, reinforcing the full scope of his devastation. However, the filmmakers found that placing the scene there disrupted the placing of the climax. Instead, the Russos decided to move it to the opening of Endgame, as it immediately re-immersed the audience in the emotional weight of Infinity War's ending before continuing with the story. Natasha's sacrifice on Vormir was originally different too. Initially, her and Clint's debate over who should sacrifice themselves was interrupted when Thanos and his goons showed up. As Clint formulates a plan to fend them off, Natasha ignores him and sprints towards the edge of the cliff, determined to sacrifice herself. As Natasha runs, Thanos' forces shoot her 3 times, but she clings to life just long enough to drag herself to the edge. When she looks back, she saves Clint before jumping off the cliff as Thanos himself approaches. From there, the scene played out as it did in the final film, with Clint being teleported to safety. However, this version of the scene lacked the emotional depth of the final cut. The attack from Thanos' forces distracted from the core of Natasha's sacrifice, cutting short the heartfelt exchange between her and Clint. And unlike the theatrical version where Clint actively fought to stop her, this iteration left him too distant to intervene, leaving no debate over which of the two was going to die. Even Nebula's death also would have been different. Originally, she would have managed to intercept the Stark Gauntlet during the chaotic game of Keep Away in the final battle. battle. Desperate to prove her worth to Thanos, she would have attempted to wield the gauntlet herself, a nod to the comics, where Nebula briefly takes control of the stones. However, she would have quickly discovered that she wasn't powerful enough to survive using them, leading to her death. This version would have further emphasized her tragic desperation for her father's approval, but ultimately, the filmmakers chose a more direct confrontation between the two versions of Nebula, reinforcing good Nebula's growth by having her kill her doppelganger when she aims her gun at Gamora. The time heist originally played out very differently in early drafts. Instead of revisiting the events of the Avengers, the team initially planned to send Tony to Asgard, where he would have worn a stealth suit to infiltrate Odin's vault to retrieve the Ether and Tesseract. Once inside, he would have faced off against Heimdall. Thor, meanwhile, would have extended scenes with Jane Foster, including a very funny scene in which Rocket has to convince Jane to allow him to remove the Ether from her body. However, after this was scrapped, the writers had Thor face off against his past self on Asgard. While this would have highlighted his growth over the last decade, the Russos felt it made the time heist overly complex. Instead, they chose to move the fighting himself concept over to Captain America, deciding that Thor's arc was better served through his emotional reunion with his mother, which played a more meaningful role in his journey of self-acceptance and healing, rather than a physical confrontation with his past self.
Yeah, because if you do too much of like the present versus the past, if you do every character doing that, it just gets too it just gets overwhelming, and it's like, okay, like this part is gonna get overlooked so much unless it's good, but even then it's like, I don't know, I'm glad that was kind of left out.
Morag was also envisioned as a much bigger set piece, completely underwater, which proved too logistically complex and didn't allow Thanos and his daughters to track the heroes at the right moment. At one point, the Tesseract was retrieved from the Triskelion, with a character then driving to Doctor Strange's house, a sequence the writers later admitted sounded absurd when spoken out loud. Initially, they avoided returning to the Avengers because it felt like they were pandering, but Joe Russo eventually pushed for it, realizing that sometimes the best choice is the one that makes the most narrative sense. The time suits were originally different too, and based on the Guardians' breather mesh that allowed them to travel into space, which would have looked like a bubble around everyone's heads. But after seeing the test footage, the Russos thought it looked awful, so they gave everyone Ant-Man inspired helmets while the breather mesh became the visor. Everyone returning from the snap was almost handled very differently. Originally, the snapped Avengers would have reappeared at the compound, but since it was well before Thanos showed up, they would have cut to everyone eating pizza to kill time, as a subtle nod to the Avengers eating shawarma in the first movie. Thor almost had a training montage to shed his weight before the final battle, showing him physically prepared to face Thanos once again. However, this was ultimately scrapped. Another version didn't even have the snapped Avengers arriving through the portals, where the camera would have rotated around Cap and everybody would have been collected behind him. When the portals were introduced, it was originally Peter Parker who would have returned from the snap first, but this was restructured to build on itself instead, making the moment even more impactful. Thanos and Doctor Strange were originally set for a rematch during the final battle, with Strange blasting Thanos' consciousness into the mindscape, presenting him with all his various crimes before being brought before the living tribunal, an all-powerful cosmic entity who would judge him guilty. While this sequence would have been a visually stunning callback to Doctor Strange, it was ultimately cut to keep the final battle on the battlefield. Thor joining the Guardians at the end.
That's a good choice, because obviously we got what we got and it was great, but it's like if you would have went away from that for any, I don't know, dude. If it's a final battle, keep the final battle where the final battle is. Don't do any other shit.
End of the film wasn't originally planned. It was a last-minute decision made during editing, sparking fan speculation that Guardians 3 might cheekily be titled as Guardians of the Galaxy. This completely blindsided James Gunn, who had just returned to Marvel and signed on to direct Guardians of the Galaxy 3, and suddenly had to figure out how to handle Thor in his story, which was already written. Luckily, Thor Love and Thunder quickly resolved the plotline, sparing Gunn from having to incorporate Thor into his film. While Avengers Endgame could have taken many different directions, the final version we got was a carefully crafted balance of nostalgia, emotional payoffs, and character-driven storytelling. From alternate deaths to drastically different time heist plans, these changes highlight just how much the film evolved during development. In the end, Endgame wasn't just about closing a chapter, it was about honoring the journey that led there, ensuring each hero got the send-off that felt true to their story. Thanks for watching, everybody. And
that was a really good video. I think Endgame, it was what it needed to be. I like I said, I think Infinity War was better. Maybe I'll make a video talking more about why I believe that. And I don't think it's an unpopular opinion. Maybe it is. Maybe it's a hot take. I don't really know. But I'm glad with the Endgame that we got. And I'm so glad a lot of that cut content did not get put into the movie.